Hi, I said I would do a review, and so I'll go ahead and do the review now. What this next two units, the next two modules, are all about is what we call categorical logic. And what categorical logic is the idea that you categorize things by saying, you know, everything that is this, or some things that are this also have this attribute, and basically you put things into categories. Is a big part of logic. I mean, the idea would be as if, you say something like, all dogs are canines, and you say, Fido is a dog, then you know that if it's the Fido is a dog, then Fido is part of the category of canines as well, because, we've just said all dogs are part of the category of canines. And so if something is in the something falls in the category of dogs, then it naturally falls in the category of canines. And so what happens is categorical logic is basically a way of saying, we put things into different categories, and then we see if it's possible for other things to be true about them because they fall into those categories. If everything is this, then, we know something about everything that is in that group. All mammals are creatures that give birth to their children while live. They feed them milk, they have hair, and so, if you say something like an elephant is a mammal, then we know that an elephant has hair. It may not be very thick, it may not be very long, but they would have hair of some sort because they are a mammal. Now, with that said, logic, I should say that it is mentioned in the lesson and everything, but the person who created logic is known the father of logic is Aristotle. And Aristotle is also known for one of his great contributions was he actually created the categorization of animals into like kingdom, phylum, genus, species, all those, I'd have to think about what the 7 categories are. But the Aristotle created that categorization method. He spent quite a bit of time basically during a period of exile from Athens. He went back and he studied biology in a very intense way, and he began to create this system of categorizing animals into things like mammals and into birds and sea creatures and plants and other things. And so this is sort of an outgrowth of that same idea that you categorize things into different groups, and then we can then make assertions that if we know it's part of the group, then we can make assertions about it. Now, in its basic form, there are basically what we call universal statements, and then there are what we call particular statements. And what a universal statement, or what we also might say, like an existential statement or a particular statement, but the universal statements are saying things about everything in a category. And those usually come into two forms. There's the form of all dogs are canines. It's saying something like everything in that category has some other attribute. All dogs are canines. All my students are online this summer. All my summer students are online. All my cats are felines. Whatever you want to say. On the other hand, then you have what we call negative universal statements, where you basically say nothing is part of the category. No dogs are felines. No dogs are cats. No people are both pregnant and not pregnant. You're making a statement about, no pregnant women are not pregnant women. Things like that. They're basically making a general statement that you're making a categorical statement saying that nothing is negative in effect, that nothing is part of the other part. Then we have what we call particular statements. Those statements are statements that, let me think of how I want to say this. Those are statements that, like, some dog is named Fido, or some person is bald, or some people have blue eyes and some people have green eyes. Those are what we would call categorical statements, or I'm sorry, not categorical. Those are what we call particular statements. It's not saying something about the entire class of people. It's not saying something about every single thing. It's saying just that there are some that have those attributes. We also might call those existential statements because one would say, if there are some people who have blue eyes, then we are saying there exists. There's existential means that it's making a claim about the existence of something. And so if they're saying there exists something, then we are saying that there exists something that is a person that has blue eyes. And so it's making an existential statement. And then we also have what we call existential statements that are negative in effect. And those are negative statements like some people are not blue-eyed, some people are not green-eyed, some people are not brown-eyed. And that's making a statement about particular members of a group, or making an existential statement, but it's saying something negative. It's saying they don't have this attribute. Some people are not, happy. Some people are not, unhappy. And so what happens is these are making claims that are negative about saying that not everything is in the class has this attribute, but there are some people in this class that don't have that attribute. And so those statements are things that that we now know are particular statements. So what happens is I'm gonna take this and I'm gonna flip it if I can get it to go here. Let me see. No, it's not gonna let me flip it midway. Sorry. So I'm gonna go ahead and do this if I can get this. This is my computer screen, and I'm gonna do it so I can see as well. And let's see if we can get this. This is always fun. I used to have a program that would let me record my computer screen, but that program is currently not installed on this computer, and that is not always the best thing. Where are we at? So what we have here is we have two different things called the square of the traditional square of opposition and what we call the modern square of opposition. This is what they call the traditional square of opposition. And if you notice, what happens is up here, if you can see this well enough, is up in the upper corner, there's a statement like, just turn my screen off, like all SRP. And then over here we have no SRP. So over there you have all SRP, and the other side you have no SRP. And then at the bottom you have some SRP and some SR not P. Now what happens with this is, and I'm going to put it here, and you can always turn in your book, or you can also use the online lesson. It's page of the first lesson. If you come here, this first lesson, categorical concepts, and you click it, and you go to page 5, you'll find it. But you can also find this in your book on page 64, and it's the same thing. But what you'll notice about this is that we give little we give vowels names to all the different categories. If it says all SRP, we call that A. A is simply a universal statement about everything in the category, and it's positive in nature, so it's all SRP. There's a negative version of it which says no SRP, and that's negative in the sense that it's universal. It's saying everything about an S is not a P, but it's also saying that no SRP is saying that it is negative because it's saying something is not true of anything that is an S. It is not a member of the P class. And then it gives you little Venn diagrams here of what that actually looks like. You come down to the bottom, some S are P we call I, and we call O, some S are not P. Now, as far as it goes, you should try to kind of memorize that A is a universal positive, E is a universal negative, I is a particular positive, and O is a particular negative, and be able to associate those, just because it makes it a little bit simpler as you're working to kind of have those in your mind. The way you can kind of do it is it goes A, E, I, O. And you can also think about that's the way those letters appear in the alphabet. A comes before E, I, O, and so if you kind of read it like a page, it follows that method. Now, with that said, what happens is with the traditional square of opposition, they make what we call an existential assumption. And an existential assumption means that their assumption is if you make a universal claim, then you assume that the particular is true. That I wouldn't say something like, all my students this summer are taking my class online. So I'm saying like, if you are a student in my summer class, then you are a student in an online class. And I'm saying all my students this summer are online students. Now, if I say that, that statement sort of seems to imply that I'm teaching students and that I have students. And so the traditional method makes the assumption that there are some students of mine this summer and they are online students. But the problem is, and that's where you get to the modern square of opposition, the modern square of opposition says, well, that's not necessarily the case. Why is that not necessarily the case? Well, because it's possible that it is quite possible that you could make a statement, a universal statement, but there be no members of that class. There be no members of that universal first S. For example, if I say all unicorns are horses with a horn, well, that for most of us accept as a true statement, but that doesn't mean that some unicorns exist that are that. And so we accept that we can make universal claims like all widgets are blue. Well, that may be a true statement in a purely mental exercise, or all unicorns are horses with horns, or all mermaids are, have tails, things like that. But yet we don't accept that makes it actually true in reality. But at least from the traditional method, they do make that assumption. And so what happens is if this is true, we assume that there exists some S that is P. If this one is true, some S are not P, or no S are P, then we assume that there exists some S that is not a P. Simple enough. Now what happens is this square of opposition is nice because it tells us that if you say something like all S are P, all dogs are canines, then we know that it would be impossible for it to be true that some dogs are not canines. Because if all dogs are canines, then some dogs cannot be canines, because that would be a contradiction. And so the square of opposition tells us that if you go from A to O, or E to I, or I to E, those two contradict. These two will always be the opposite. If this one's true, this one has to be false. If this one's true, that one has to be false. If this one's true, it has to be false. True, that one has to be false. Those are always going to be the opposite truth values. These, in the traditional square, if true on the upper side, are going to be true on the lower side, and so on. And if these are false, then we know we can't make a universal claim, and we know we can't make a universal claim. And so we have these little arrows telling us how those work. Now what happens is, just because some S or P, just because some dogs are named Fido, doesn't mean all dogs are named Fido. But if it's false that there is no dog named Fido, then we would know that all dogs are not named Fido. We know if that's false, then the universal statement is false, but we don't know anything more than that. Then the other thing here is we have what we call contraries and subcontraries. And contraries and subcontraries basically say that these two cannot both be true. You can't have all dogs are canines and no dogs are canines. They could both be false. For example, I could say all my students in the fall are online students. Well, that's just not true. None of my students in the fall are online students. Well, that's just not true either. I have both in the fall. And so that would be where you have a contrary. They can not both be true because that would contradict, but they can both be false. And on the bottom, they can't they cannot both be false if we make an existential assumption, but they cannot both be true, and that is but they may both be true. And in that case, some of my students are online, some of my students are not online. If you're assuming I have students, then we assume that they have to fall into one category or the other. This one's a little bit of a stretch, I think, but by and large, you can kind of follow this. And these allow us to make moves from one statement to another. If all S or P, I know that is true, then I know this is false, and I can also take the false and move it up and know that's false. I also know that that's false because if that's true, that has to be false, and if this one's true, that one has to be false. And so this traditional square of opposition allows us to see that if one of those statements is a true statement, we know the truth value of the others.